The coronavirus will change the way we vote this November. For the first time, all registered voters will receive a mail-in ballot by late October, even if you normally vote in person. LA County residents can return their ballot in a number of ways. You can mail it back using the provided postage-paid envelope, which must be postmarked by November 3rd. This year, ballots have 17 days in order to be counted. You can also take your ballot to a secure county ballot drop box, or you can drop off your ballot or vote in person at any of the county's voting centers. They'll open a few days before the election. These centers will enforce mask wearing and strict social distancing measures. If you did not vote during the March primary, you'll notice a few changes. First, polling places have been replaced with voting centers. What does that mean? You'll no longer be confined to voting in your neighborhood. You can now go to any center in the county to cast your ballot. Second, there are new electronic devices you can use to mark your ballot. These machines offer larger type and options for different languages and accessibility. The deadline to register to vote is October 19th. If you miss the deadline, you can fill out a conditional registration form at your local voting center between October 20th and November 3rd. You can still vote on election day, but you won't get your ballot in the mail. Need a replacement ballot? Contact the county registrar's office by phone or email. Or you can head to your voting center to cast your ballot in person. To find out where your local voting center is, go to lavote.net. And to learn more about the 12 statewide propositions on the ballot this year and our editorial endorsements, head over to the LA Times website.
Good evening and welcome to Ask a Reporter, the live meetup series where Los Angeles Times journalists discuss the news and answer your questions about current events, behind-the-scenes decision-making, and the stories we cover. I'm Sewell Chan. As the editorial page editor of the Los Angeles Times, I oversee our editorials, our op-ed section, and letters to the editor. Tonight, I'm here with 7 members of our editorial board to discuss our endorsements for the 2020 election and to answer your questions about our endorsement process of making recommendations for voters. I will moderate a discussion for about 45 minutes, and then we will answer questions from Los Angeles Times subscribers. So if you've joined us on Zoom, please share your questions in the questions module. What exactly is an editorial? Put simply, it's an unsigned article expressing the Los Angeles Times' collective opinion on a matter of public interest. It's the place in the newspaper where we put aside our objective news gathering to join our readers in a dialogue about important issues of the day. To be very clear, as the opinion editor of the Los Angeles Times, I do not speak for the reporters and editors on the news side of the Times. We keep news and opinion separate. Our 9 editorial writers meet 3 times a week, these days on Zoom. We bat around ideas and arguments, meet with experts and elected officials, and arrive at conclusions by consensus, sometimes after vigorous debate. But before I introduce my colleagues, we have a poll question for readers. Here it is. Voting by mail is now the norm in California, and county registrars began sending ballots to registered voters on October 5th. This election, do you plan to vote by mail, by dropping off your ballot at a polling center or in a drop box, in person on November 3rd, or you're not sure yet? We'll report back the results of this poll question in just a few minutes. Now I'd like to briefly introduce our editorial board members. First off will be John Healy. He's our deputy editor writing about the economy, regulation, technology, healthcare, and Congress. Marielle Garza focuses on state government and politics, public health, and other topics, including trash and recycling. Robert Green writes about water, drought, criminal justice reform, policing, mental health, and the Los Angeles County government. Carla Hall is our authority on homelessness, reproductive rights, human rights, animal welfare, and other topics, including popular culture and the movies. Carrie Kavanaugh covers Los Angeles City Hall, as well as regional issues, with a focus on housing, transportation, and the environment. Michael McGough, based in Washington, D.C., covers the federal government, Congress, and the Supreme Court. Last but not least, Karen Klein writes about education, COVID-19, the environment, food, and science. Now we're ready to share the result. Now we're ready to share the results, sorry for the delay, from poll question number 1. Very interesting. 62% of you, more than I would have thought, plan to vote in person on November 3rd. And I'd like to hear the reasons why. I suspect that a lot of you, like many voters, feel that voting in person is still the most safe and certain way to get your vote counted. I am one of many Californians, a record number this year, who have chosen to vote by absentee ballot. And I actually cast my ballot in a drop-off box about a week and a half ago, as 7% of you did. And 21% of you are planning to vote by mail, and 10% are not sure yet. Very interesting. Now we have one second poll question before we get to the editorial writers. Aside from the presidential race, what issues on the November ballot concern you the most this election season? Voting rights and election integrity? The Los Angeles County District Attorney race? California state propositions and ballot measures? Or local races here in Los Angeles? Please be sure to answer as you did for the last poll question. Now we're about to kick off our discussion, my favorite part. We're going to start with our presidential endorsement. On September 10th, the Times endorsed Joe Biden, saying he was more than just anybody but Trump, but someone who would advance a progressive agenda for the United States. My colleague, Mike McGough, is here to explain why. Welcome, Mike.
Thanks, Ul.
Mike, Los Angeles. Go ahead.
We endorsed early. We mentioned in our editorial that it was usual to wait for the presidential debates, but we didn't want to. So we were sort of clairvoyant because the first debate was a disaster and the second debate was canceled. But the real reason we endorsed early is that we had had plenty of time to assess both President Trump and Joe Biden. And we were completely convinced that President Trump had demonstrated that he was a terrible president on several levels, and that Biden had, in several months as the front runner, shown that he was really an excellent replacement.
Mike, what did you learn from the first debate, the one in which there was so much interruption and shouting?
Not very much. We learned, among other things, that Donald Trump was not confident enough about his performance in office to be quiet while Joe Biden talked, or even to be patient while the moderator tried to ask him questions. His strategy was clearly to go in screaming and blustering, so he really wouldn't have to answer any questions. And that's been pretty characteristic of his administration almost from the beginning. A lot of heat, not very much light.
Mike, sometimes I, as the opinion page editor, hear from readers who say the Los Angeles Times is sometimes too knee-jerk, too liberal. How do you and how do members of our editorial board communicate to the 40% and more of voters nationwide who still support the president?
I think we have been fair. There have been some times when we have praised things President Trump has done. We were praiseworthy when he got serious about trying to reduce U.S. troops in Afghanistan, although he didn't execute that policy very well. We praised him when he had a lot of influence on a peace agreement between Israel and the United Arab Emirates. We did not endorse him the last time around, but we were willing to give him a chance. But it became pretty clear pretty soon that he really did not take this office seriously, that he saw it as a way to aggrandize his own interests, that he wouldn't listen to experts, and that he was really continuing the reality show, I suppose, that got him elected in the first place.
Mike, one last question for now. It turns out that the Los Angeles Times only endorsed Republicans from its founding in 1881 all the way through 1972. What's changed since then?
Well, I think society has changed. The management of the newspaper has changed. I think also politics have changed. Unfortunately, there are not a lot of Republicans, especially since Trump became president, who are willing to stake out a moderate course. And we are willing, and we do it in every election season, to listen to candidates from every party. We are not a knee-jerk liberal democratic publication. We have an open mind, but the way politics has developed in recent years, there's not much of a middle ground.
I'm going to want to come back to that moment when we have our audience Q&A. Thanks so much, Mike, for these insights.
Sure. Thank you.
Now I'd like to share results from poll question number 2. Wow, the top category is voting rights and election integrity, followed by the Los Angeles County District Attorney race, local races, and then California ballot measures. That's very, very interesting. There's immense concern this year, of course, with the United States really having nationwide voting by mail option, although varying state by state, for the first time due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Thank you, readers. That's very, very interesting poll results. We'll come back to them. Now we're going to get to discussion of some of the important California measures on this ballot. Next, first of all, we'll discuss Proposition 16, which would reinstate affirmative action in public employment, public education, and public contracting in California. Our editorial board recommends voting yes on Prop 16. I'd like to welcome my colleague, Marielle Garza, to explain why. Welcome, Marielle.
Hi, Sol, and everybody for joining us tonight. I appreciate it. Yeah, so go ahead. You're going to ask a question. Sorry.
Marielle, in 1996, California voters passed Prop 209, prohibiting consideration of race, gender, and ethnicity in public education and contracting. Why should that be overturned?
Well, here's the thing. We have this myth in this nation that anybody can achieve anything regardless of the circumstances of their birth. This is some great meritocracy. That's never been true. And this summer, we're sort of facing it as part of our reckoning with this legacy of racism in this country. One of the tools that has been used historically to get at unequal opportunities has been affirmative action programs. California used them to fairly successfully up until 24 years ago when it was prohibited by a ballot measure. Since then, the state's efforts to diversify its workforce, its applicant pool for the UCs, has really been set back. It's estimated that small businesses owned by women and non-white people have lost $1 billion a year in revenue from public contracting because there were preferential programs. And we think it's time to get rid of this ban on this tool. Now, I want to make something clear. This is not a mandate. This doesn't automatically reinstate affirmative action. It simply gives state agencies, local governments, public universities, and educational systems to use affirmative action programs when and if they're needed. If there are programs that are they're not being able to get the applicants they need. This is not a mandate. It is merely allowing what most of the other states are able to do.
Marielle, some opponents of Prop 16 say that it could lead to quotas in government hiring and UC admissions that favor unqualified candidates, and that affirmative action programs themselves are a form of discrimination. How would you respond to those objections?
I would say simply that it won't result in quotas because quotas are unconstitutional. These are not quotas. And I understand there's a lot of fear about what this might mean in terms of, there's another myth that we have is that affirmative action programs only benefit unqualified people, as if there are not enough applicants for UC positions or for jobs who are not qualified, and just because their gender or their race, they're suddenly going to get a job that some other person deserves. Well, that's just not true. For one thing, in our UCs, so many completely qualified applicants of every color and every gender are they're just not let in. There's only few spaces. So this idea that we're going to suddenly open the gate to unqualified people, it's kind of offensive. It's like saying, well, if you're black or brown or woman or whatever, you're probably not qualified. And I just think that's not true. There's been no or very little evidence of that being true.
Marielle, our nation and our region have gone through a painful reckoning on race and racism following the May 25th death of George Floyd and a surge of Black Lives Matter activism. Did those events influence the editorial board or your thinking on Prop 16?
It didn't influence the editorial board or my thinking. The editorial board opposed Proposition 209 back in 1996, and our editorial position on that has not changed. I personally believe that affirmative action programs, which have benefited me and people that I know and love, who are completely qualified, so I believe that they're an effective tool. Again, not a quota, merely a tool.
Thank you so much, Marielle. We'll return to you in a moment.
Thanks.
Next, we're going to discuss Prop 22, which would treat employees of app-based services like Uber and Lyft as independent contractors.
Remember the controversy last year over AB 5 or Assembly Bill 5? The law made it much harder for some companies to treat their workers as independent contractors as opposed to employees. This had a big impact on the gig economy, including companies like Uber and Lyft. Enter Proposition 22. It was put on the ballot thanks to signatures collected by a campaign organized by Uber and Lyft. It would essentially exclude app-based drivers from AB 5, allowing companies to consider them independent contractors. The measure promises some worker benefits, like an hourly wage slightly above the state minimum, a monthly health insurance stipend for some drivers, and new medical and disability benefits if a driver is injured on the job. Opponents say billion-dollar corporations like Uber and Lyft shouldn't be allowed to refuse their workers full-time employee benefits, like Social Security, normal reimbursements for their costs, overtime pay, and the right to organize.
We recommend voting no on Prop 22. My colleague John Healy is here to discuss the issue. John, why did the California legislature pass AB 5?
The backstory here is maybe a decade or so ago, a number of years ago, a trucking company called Dynamex decided, hey, all of our employees, all of the drivers who work for us, we're now going to treat them as independent contractors. So no more wage and hour protections, no more unemployment insurance, none of that stuff. Well, there was a lawsuit, of course, and it went to the Supreme Court. And in 2018, the Supreme Court said, let's change the way we decide whether somebody in California is an independent contractor or an employee. And one of the key changes was the court saying that unless you're doing work that is outside the main line of business of the company for whom you're doing it, you are an employee. So let me state that again and make sure I got it right. In order to not be an employee, you have to be doing work that's outside the main line of business. So that meant for a whole bunch of independent contractors, freelance employees, actors, musicians, and gig-based workers, they suddenly could become employees. Now, Uber and Lyft have employees. Those are the people who write their software code, who do their marketing, things like that. And now, under AB 5, all their drivers would be employees too.
John, Prop 22 proposes a fix for AB 5. Why do you think Prop 22 is the wrong answer?
The fix only applies to the drivers for these app-based services. So there's a whole bunch of other independent contractors who become employees or have to be treated as employees that under the state legislature's approach, AB 5, there's no flexibility there. The state legislature should have taken a broader approach. They didn't. We think that Prop 22 should have taken a broader approach too. It did not. And in addition to that, the fix that it provides for drivers, the wage guarantees, the benefit guarantees, the other protections are pretty ungenerous. And that just strikes us as setting a troublesome template as this issue goes forward. We really think that there ought to be a third category of work, and there's plenty of good work that's been done to say how that might be set up, and the legislature ought to pursue that.
John, you and I and our colleagues met with advocates on both sides of Prop 22. Both sides presented Uber and Lyft drivers who spoke with us about their experiences. Some drivers, especially those who tend to work full-time, oppose Prop 22 because they think it weakens employee protections. Other drivers, however, including those who just do maybe a few hours a week here or there, seem to support Prop 22. What did you take away from our discussions with drivers?
I think that it's probably not completely accurate to break it down into drivers who do 40 hours and drivers who do less. There are a lot of drivers for whom the flexibility, even those who work 40, 50 hours, the flexibility is paramount. And Uber and Lyft and Postmates and the other companies that are involved in this, affected by this, they make a persuasive case that if they had to treat everybody as employees, they'd have to change their business model completely. And they'd have to go to shift workers. To the folks, the drivers who do not support that, the drivers who are backing Prop 22, that's going to make the job undoable for them. These may be people with young kids that they need to spend time with, or people who, for one reason or another, need to be able to set their own hours.
John, like many of our readers, I use app-based transportation services. I keep getting notifications on my phone saying that Prop 22, if it's not passed, there will be dire consequences, maybe even put Uber and Lyft out of business in California. How do you address that objection?
Well, the one time that, there may be multiple times that this happened, but in the United States, when Austin, Texas, adopted regulations that were very tough on the app-based services, the app-based services withdrew. So it is entirely plausible that they will say to California, look, forget it. It's also, I think, quite reasonable for them to argue that it would take them a long time, months, if not more, to redesign their software so that it's not built for on-demand drivers. It's built for a steady workforce of shift-based drivers. Now, when they leave, other sorts of app-based services could come in that already treat their drivers as employees. So that's what happened in Austin. So it doesn't necessarily mean the end of the world for customers. It could be a very bad thing, though, for all the drivers in this state, and there's tens of thousands of them, who rely on Uber, Lyft, et cetera, to get the either the side hustle or the reliable sort of money that they need.
John, you've given so much thought to this. I really appreciate your clear explanation, and we'll talk again in a few minutes. Next up, I'd like to welcome my colleague, Robert Green. He is our authority on criminal justice matters. Our editorial board endorsed George Gascon in the race for Los Angeles County District Attorney, and I'd like to welcome Rob to explain why.
Thank you, Sewell. Happy to be here.
Rob, the Los Angeles Times editorial board twice before endorsed Jackie Lacey for district attorney in 2012 and 2016. What's changed?
Right, good question. Well, first let me start by saying that we said a year ago this race for Los Angeles County District Attorney was very likely the second most important election in the nation after the presidential election, and we meant it. And the reason for that is an elected district attorney has an enormous power over the quality of the justice system. And so to turn to your question, in 2012, we were very enthusiastic about Jackie Lacey because of a sort of mix of caution and open-mindedness. We thought she was the right person to shepherd through a number of criminal justice reforms that would improve the justice system for all of us, reduce recidivism, improve efficiency. And we endorsed her again in 2016 when she didn't have any opponent. And I have to say that looking back over that time, we have been at least as much disappointed as we have been satisfied. There have been a number of criminal justice reforms that came up during her tenure and she has opposed virtually every single one of them. And it's not as though these kinds of things like reducing felonies to misdemeanors and other basic reforms like increasing opportunities for parole, it's not like they haven't been tried successfully in other jurisdictions where there are more forward-looking prosecutors. So, for example, Philadelphia, Chicago, San Francisco, for example. So we look to George Gascon, who was district attorney in San Francisco, and the way he handled criminal justice reforms there. In fact, he led on many of them in California. And we said we could do better. We can do better in Los Angeles County. We can do better for safety. We can do better for justice. We can do better for diversion from the criminal justice system, for efficiency. We went with George Gascon.
Now, Rob, some of Mr. Gascon's critics say that crime in San Francisco was worse under his tenure than it is in Los Angeles under District Attorney Lacey. And some also say that Gascon didn't do enough to prosecute or hold accountable police misconduct in San Francisco. How do you respond to those criticisms?
Well, interesting points. Now, we have to look at crime in both Los Angeles and San Francisco and note that there's been ups and downs, but there have been upticks in crimes in both jurisdictions. So we have to say, well, who was worse on crime? Was it Lacey in Los Angeles or Gascon in San Francisco? Kind of a two-part answer. Number one is that you do look to the district attorney for an improvement of the justice system, which can affect crime over time, but it's not necessarily useful to look at a particular year and say that the district attorney's policy did this or did that. So I'm less concerned about general upticks in particular types of crime that have gone up and have gone down, either in San Francisco or in Los Angeles. Nevertheless, I've got to say that in Los Angeles, the problem has been an uptick in violent crime. In San Francisco, it's been an uptick in property crime.
Now, Rob, Mayor Garcetti was one of the elected officials who now endorses George Gascon. He actually switched his support from Lacey to Gascon. Why do you think that happened?
I cannot speak for the mayor of Los Angeles. I can say only that he's got his own reasons, and we have to just look at some obvious facts. He's a politician. He's the mayor of the city. And is it that he looked at which way the political winds were blowing and decided that he wanted to get with a reformer? Because this has been very much a year of attention to injustices and inequities. I think that would be unfair if we just left it at that. And I would like to ask him that question. But his own answer has been that, yes, he believes that George Gascon is a person who is better on matters of operations of the of a district attorney's office on questions of especially racial equity and justice.
Finally, Rob, please tell us a little bit about the role of police unions in the DA race.
Oh, well, police unions have had a large role in raising funds and supporting candidates and ballot measures for as long as anybody can remember. And so they do that for district attorney candidates as well. And of course, they have an interest in that because police want to see crooks go to jail. Police also want to make sure that they're not held to account if there are incidents of excessive force. So that's a big issue in this race. Jackie Lacey has gotten a lot of criticism for not prosecuting police officers who have been accused of using deadly excessive force. And in fact, Jackie Lacey has been the beneficiary of millions of dollars in police union funds. George Gascon has said that he won't accept police union donations, which is something that we would like to see. We would like to break that connection between police union funds, donations, and district attorney candidates. We also have to say that George Gascon probably wasn't going to get those funds anyway, because even though he served as police chief in San Francisco and police chief in Mesa, Arizona, and was an assistant chief in Los Angeles, he is a reformer, and reform doesn't always sit well with the police union folks.
Rob, there are several other matters relating to criminal justice on this year's ballot. There's Prop 20, which would roll back certain criminal justice reforms. We recommend no. There's Prop 25, which would end the use of cash bail. We recommended yes. Finally, there's something called Measure J here in Los Angeles County, which would shift funding and resources away from prisons, law enforcement, probation, and toward health, social services, and housing. Could you tell us a little bit about Measure J and why we decided to recommend yes.
Sure. Well, so I should point out that we were critical when the Board of Supervisors put Measure J on the ballot in the first place because we thought that they hadn't done their homework and that it kind of came out of nowhere. And we were concerned that there were a lot of questions that we didn't get answers to. Well, over the weeks, we did get answers to our questions, and we have been very supportive in Los Angeles County of their program of alternatives to incarceration. So rather than expanding jails, rather than expanding criminal punishment without necessarily getting any return in reduced recidivism, we have encouraged Los Angeles County to follow a program of alternatives to incarceration where people are diverted when they need it into mental health care or when they need it into treatment for addiction or any one of a number of other options, so long as the public is kept safe. And so this measure will actually put some money behind that effort, which is necessary if it's actually going to happen. And doesn't actually divert money away from the sheriff or any other law enforcement agency. It does say that for a certain very slim percentage of discretionary county funds, so about 10% of the locally generated discretionary funds that the county spends, those won't be spent on the sheriff and the jail and law enforcement, probation, et cetera. Those will be spent on healthcare, alternatives to incarceration, housing, and other things that can divert people from the criminal justice system and make sure that they do not return to it.
Rob, thank you so much for that very clear explanation. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks, Sewell.
Next, we're going to learn about Proposition 15, which would create a so-called property tax split roll for commercial and industrial real estate.
Prop 15 is about how much businesses and corporations pay in California property taxes. Since 1978, all property taxes have been based on the purchase price of the property, not its current value. Prop 15 would change that, but only for commercial and industrial properties. The measure would require owners of these properties to pay taxes that more accurately reflect the present-day values. Residential properties like your home would not be affected. That extra tax revenue would go to local government services and schools. The changes would come in phased in over 3 years. Some small businesses would have a longer transition period to the higher taxes. Other business property owners could actually be exempt from the new law. Supporters, including a long list of Democrats in Congress, Joe Biden, the ACLU, and several unions, say major corporations shouldn't get the same tax benefits as homeowners. Opponents say that Prop 15 could discourage companies from setting up shop in California.
We recommend voting yes on Prop 15. My colleague, Kerry Kavanaugh, welcome. Kerry, California faces immense challenges: budget deficits, underfunded public schools, infrastructure badly in need of repair. Why is Prop 15 the right answer to these problems?
So Prop 15 has been in the works for several years as a split roll. And it's the right solution because California has a messed up tax system. And Prop 15, by creating the split roll in our property tax system, is an important step towards improving the tax system to make it more equal, to make it more competitive, and to raise much needed revenue for a state that is far behind in education spending, that has tremendous service needs, and really needs the money.
Kerry, the Los Angeles Times was one of the few editorial boards to support Prop 15. Why is that?
So like I said, there's general agreement that California's tax system is pretty messed up. There's gross inequities, particularly in the property tax system, because people who bought under Prop 13, people who bought their property years ago pay significantly less taxes than people who buy today or recently. And in particular, that has a real anti-competitive effect on commercial property owners. So, like I said, widespread agreement that the tax system is messed up. Some of the other editorial boards said, you know what, don't pass Prop 15, wait for comprehensive tax reform so California can finally fix its messed up tax system. Well, the LA Times editorial board says we've been waiting and advocating for tax reform for many, many, many years. And waiting for the perfect is not going to happen. Prop 15 is a really smart and important step toward making a more equitable just, and fair tax system for the state.
Carrie, California is in economic upheaval because of the COVID-19 pandemic. Businesses have laid off workers. Some small businesses have shut down or are at risk of shutting down. Isn't this a precarious or fragile time for our economy? What about the argument that it's not a good time to change the property tax system?
And like I said, the split roll proposal has been around for several years. This has been in the works. And it's kind of a good luck, bad luck timing for this ballot measure. People are understandably concerned about the impact on business, particularly small business. So it's important to remember that the reassessments of commercial properties won't begin until 2022. And then they'll continue in phases through 2025. Hopefully, by that point, we'll be out of our COVID pandemic economic downturn. But there is also something else to consider about the impact on businesses. There's been some economic analysis that, it's market conditions, supply and demand, that drives rents, not property taxes. And I doubt that there's a lot of tenants out there, commercial tenants, that have been getting their rent kept below market rate because their landlord has low property taxes. So to a certain degree, the property taxes may have an effect, and particularly for businesses, small businesses that own their own property, they will see an impact. But for many other businesses that are renting, their rents are already at market rates, presumably. The other reason we've liked this is because the good news, and why this is good timing for Prop 15, is California is having serious economic problems. And we now see that there's a need for robust government services. Yet ever since Prop 13 passed, 4 decades ago, in terms of property tax, cities and counties lost about 60% of their revenue, property tax revenue, and they've never really regained that. So there's a need, particularly now that we see the impact and the need for strong government services. I think that perhaps Prop 15 will give people an opportunity to, again, rejigger the tax system, make it more equal, and bring in much needed money for California services.
Carrie, finally, it's been 42 years since Prop 13 was passed. What prospects are there in Sacramento? What political appetite is there for fundamental tax reform?
That's the evergreen question in Sacramento. Every year, there's a lot of hopefulness that will address the tax system, particularly the personal income taxes, which are very dependent on the stock market and capital gains, so they tend to swing wildly, which is very detrimental for government programs, education, because their budgets go up and down, up and down. So, we always hope springs eternal, but so far, and particularly if Prop 15 passes, it'll be interesting to see if the sort of break finally in Prop 13, which again has been untouched for 40 years or so, that will encourage lawmakers to really get serious about broader tax reform. That's our hope as an editorial board, but you never know.
Thank you so much, Carrie. Next, we're going to discuss Proposition 14, which would issue $5.5 billion in general obligation bonds for California's Stem Cell Research Institute.
Back in 2004, California voters approved selling bonds for a state government stem cell research program, but that funding has almost run out. Proposition 14 would borrow an additional $5.5 billion to continue stem cell research. There would also be a few more rules for how those research funds are spent. Most of the funds would be spent on either grants for conducting research, trials and programs, or startup costs for facilities. The measure would also subsidize training programs for students studying for careers in stem cell research. $1.5 billion of the bonds would go towards therapies and treatments for brain and nervous system diseases like Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and dementia. Supporters say funding stem cell research has the potential to help those suffering from chronic disease and injury, and that the measure would improve public oversight over the institute spending those funds. Opponents say stem cell clinics have been underregulated, and California's money would be better spent elsewhere.
We recommend voting no on Prop 14. Welcome, Karen Klein. How are you?
Good, thanks, Sewell. Yes,
Karen,
yeah.
Let me begin by asking you about the start of the California Stem Cell Research Initiative in 2004. Why did it pass back then as Prop 71? Why was it worthy of Californian support?
Well, you're right, Sewell. It was an odd proposition to pass at the time, though our editorial board supported it. It's not the usual thing that state governments do is fund large-scale scientific research. That's something the federal government does and spends billions and billions of dollars on every year. In this case, back then, former President George W. Bush had initiated a ban on most embryonic stem cell funding, which was seen as extremely promising, still is, because it uses cells that don't yet have a function and therefore could sort of be trained to be any kind of cell and possibly address issues that we had not ever been able to address, like paralysis, regrowing tissue, possibly diabetes, Parkinson's disease, Alzheimer's, intractable diseases that cause incredible suffering and cost lives. And we could be at the forefront of ending that suffering. And we could refuse to allow other governments, which were surely going to take the lead on this kind of research. We could keep them from doing it. We were perfectly well set up to do it because California is a biomedical powerhouse. In addition, there was a chance for us to make money from it. If these discoveries made real money, some of that money would come back to us. So it was seen as an investment in our future. We would start a business that was a clean, well-paid business for our future, for educated people to go into, good for our economy, but we'd also possibly get direct money back into the state coffers and do well by doing good.
So our editorial board in 2004 endorsed Proposition 71, but this year we're recommending no on Prop 14. Why the change?
A lot has changed since then, but the biggest difference is, as I said, the idea behind Proposition 71 was that we were going to kickstart an industry. We were going to get the stem cell industry going, and that required some public investment. We never intended to underwrite an industry forever. We intended to kickstart it. If it hasn't been kickstarted, then Proposition 71 did not succeed, although it has succeeded in some ways. There have been some good discoveries. Now it's time for the private sector to take over. Other things have changed as well. When President Barack Obama took office, he changed the rules. So the federal government started funding embryonic stem cell research. And that has continued under Trump. In fact, it has increased under Trump. It's under some threat. There are senators that want it stopped. But right now, the federal government is spending that money. There's robust private investment in that. So there really isn't the kind of need of, gosh, this isn't going to happen if we don't step in and make it happen. On top of that, Prop 71 is asking for almost twice as much money. And it's asking for that money at a time when we are not in a good position to pay for it. Between the pandemic and what we have seen are the yawning social justice needs in this state, those are the first priorities for a state to spend its money on. And they have to be higher priorities right now than trying to continue kickstarting or somehow continue funding the stem cell industry.
Karen, if Prop 14 does not pass, how will funding still be available for research into intractable and terrible health conditions and diseases?
Well, the state is not the only funder of this research. There are foundations that are funding it. There are private companies that are investing in it. And as I said, the federal government is still spending quite a bit of money on it, about $2 billion a year on stem cell research, and about $350 million of that is for embryonic stem cell research. And what Prop 71 funded was not just embryonic. In fact, the two most successful research initiatives they've had that resulted in FDA-approved drugs were non-embryonic research, non-embryonic stem cells, which could have been funded by the federal government. There was nothing against that under the Bush rule. So probably the best thing if people want continued stem cell funding is to vote for Biden, because we can be pretty certain that he will stick with the idea of embryonic stem cell research.
Thanks so much, Karen. Next, we're going to discuss Prop 17, which would allow parolees in California to vote.
In California, those convicted of felonies aren't allowed to vote until they've completed their parole. Proposition 17 would change that, allowing parolees to vote. This measure was put on the ballot by the state legislature and follows a trend in other states to restore voting rights to those on parole. In California, this measure would affect about 40,000 parolees. Those in favor of Prop 17, including several Democrats in Congress, say parolees are often working, raising families, and paying taxes, so they should be able to vote. Opponents, mostly Republicans and conservative activists, say parolees are still completing their sentences and have yet to regain the trust of society, so they don't deserve the privilege of voting.
We recommend voting yes on Prop 17. My colleague Carla Hall is here to tell us why. Welcome, Carla.
Thanks, Sewell.
Carla, are there other states that allow felons on parole to vote?
There's 17 states and the District of Columbia that allow felons on parole to vote while they're on parole. And then there are 2 states that never took away the right to vote from anyone who goes to prison, and that's Vermont and Maine.
Carla, besides voting rights, what other rights are restricted for felons on parole?
In the state of California, you cannot own a firearm while you're on parole. You can't travel 50 miles from your home without special approval. You have to check in with a parole agent, make sure that they know where you are and how you're doing. All those are things, those are restrictions that are designed to protect public safety. That's what that's about. Because when you're on parole, you're showing that you can re-enter society successfully and lawfully. The right to vote is not a public safety issue. And in fact, if anything, having the right to vote allows a parolee to feel more connected to the society that they've returned to. The whole point of parole is to have a period where you re-enter society, and you want to do it. The whole idea is to do it successfully. That means getting a job, fulfilling family obligations, getting a home, staying out of trouble. There's a belief that if you also have a right to vote, then if you have that restored, that only helps you feel like you have more at stake in this community that you've returned to.
Carla, we've heard from victims of crime or relatives of victims of crime who say that felons have committed serious crimes, sometimes violent crimes, and should not have these full voting rights restored. What do you say to that objection?
Well, I think in California, the people who are leading the opposition to Prop 17 are people who are family members of victims of horrible crimes. In one case, there's a woman whose sister was murdered. And they believe that a couple of things. One, that having the right to vote restored is an affront to the family members of these victims. And they also believe that voting is a reward and you justify getting it returned to you by successfully going through parole. We completely understand their anguish over what happened to them, but this is not the way that we want people who are coming out of prison to re-enter society. We want to help them re-enter. Voting, we believe, the editorial board believes, is a right that should be restored to them.
Thank you so much, Carla.
You're welcome.
Thanks to all of my colleagues. Now we're about to go to Q&A with our audience. So please, if you're a subscriber and you're here in the Zoom room, please put your questions in the question box. Now we're going to have one more poll of readers. Did tonight's discussion of the ballot propositions change your thinking about how you plan to vote? Click all that apply. Trump versus Biden, Prop 16 on affirmative action, Prop 22 on gig workers, District Attorney Gascon versus Lacey, property tax reform, stem cell research, parolees' right to vote. Be curious to see what you say. Now, while we're waiting for those poll results to come in, I'm going to start taking a couple of audience questions. One audience member asks, I'd love to hear about the research involved, who you consulted and how, who among you offered to write each endorsement, the process of assigning the writing, the process involved in drafting and editing, and of course, how you voted and came to final decisions. I'm actually going to start a little bit by talking about our process. In addition to meeting 3 times a week, we held separate endorsement meetings for every single one of these ballot measures. We offered each official side a chance to come in and brief us. And of course, we did lots of original research. We called expert sources. We read policy reports. We talked to advocacy groups. For each measure, we solely applied our independent judgment and the application of long-held values. As for the process of assigning the writing, it's a little bit organic. Each of my colleagues kind of took on editorials that matched their interests, that matched their area of policy expertise, and we do truly write and edit as a group. Each member of the editorial board pitched, for example, the position that we ended up taking, and we all had discussions about it, sometimes robust discussions. One of the most fascinating parts about the editorial board, in fact, is that we really do try to arrive at consensus. Now, there are sometimes disagreements, but when there are, we really try to understand the person who's objecting and their reasons why, and to try to use that objection to strengthen the policy position that we take. Now, before we get to more Q&A, we would like to show the results of the third poll question. Okay, we will do that in just a minute. Okay, colleagues, are you all ready now, and can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
Great. Okay, let's take some questions from readers. One question. What is the criteria that the Times editorial board uses in making endorsements for candidates for public office? Do you have a criteria for which candidates you meet or interview? Rob, I'd like you to take that question.
Sure. The Times editorial board is maybe a little bit unusual in that, much to the consternation of some of us, especially during interview time, if you're on the ballot, we are going to invite you to the interview. It doesn't matter how much money you've raised. It doesn't matter what endorsements you've gotten. We're going to give you some time. Actually, this year it's been a little bit easier because of Zoom. The candidates didn't have to come all the way down to our offices, so it's worked out in some ways better than it might have otherwise. But we talk to every candidate who, or we invite every candidate who qualifies for the ballot.
Now, I have a question for John. John, sometimes members of the editorial board have had to write editorials that they actually don't personally agree with. Can you tell us under what circumstances that occurs and how we deal with it?
Well, as you noted, every editorial is something that we write as a group. And some of the, just talking in the endorsement context, some of the candidates and some of the propositions represent positions that divide the board. We're not super ideological, but we do have differences on things. And so what that means for the person who's the expert in that area is they have to present the consensus of the board and make the best possible argument for it. And sometimes it helps actually to have somebody who's not crazy about the position that you're taking to actually make the argument for that, because they understand what all the arguments on the other side are.
That gets to a question from another reader who asks, is this board overwhelmingly Democratic? Not a criticism, just curious. Maybe Mike can answer that question.
I don't, sure. I will say that I'm a registered Democrat because I live in the District of Columbia, and it is one of those places where the election that really counts often is the Democratic primary. And if you want to have an influence on who is ultimately the mayor of Washington, D.C., for example, you had better be a Democrat. This isn't unique to the District of Columbia. I used to work in Pittsburgh, and I had an editor who registered Democrat, even though he had been a Republican, because it was also a strong Democratic city. I don't think we all, I can't speak for everybody, but I can sort of guess. I don't think of myself as a particularly partisan person. I'm interested in issues. I'm interested in ideas in my life. I have voted for Republican candidates for the U.S. Senate, for governor, for other offices. And the kind of work we do is not the same kind of work that a political power broker does. We're really interested in issues and ideas more than party.
Carrie, a question for you. One of our readers asks, are the commercials wrong when they say that Prop 15 could kill relatively smaller and minority-owned businesses that will have higher tax bills passed on to them? Could it increase income inequality? This reader goes on to say, California is a high-tax state, even if the taxation is not structured properly. What's the best answer to business owners of all demographics and backgrounds and their employees as to why they should make sacrifices for the greater good in the middle of a deep recession? This city is already a small business ghost town. How would Prop 15 help LA recover?
First of all, never believe political ads. Always take them with a grain of salt. But there are legitimate concerns about the effects on small businesses. As I mentioned before, one of the sort of buffers is that the reassessments don't happen until 2022 and then through 2025. There's a real question as to what will be the larger impact. There's some on the no side. There is a lot of concern that the property tax increase will be passed on to tenants and that they will be hurting and that you'll see a lot of loss of mom and pops. If that were to happen, it would be a ghost town and you'd see a lot of vacancies. And so a property owner would no longer have that income coming in. So to a certain degree, a property owner has to be savvy to what the market conditions are and charge a rent that the market will bear. The concern, when we were doing our interviews with the pro and con side on Prop 15, we did actually have a group come in from a minority business group in the Bay Area, and they made the case that, listen, we think we'll be just fine. We don't think property owners are passing us any type of tax break right now in our rent, and we don't foresee if this passes that we'll suddenly have our rent jump up astronomically. And that, in fact, this might level the playing field by, in some ways, closing some corporate loopholes that have allowed companies to evade having their properties reassessed when they change hands. And then also, if you're a new company coming into the California market and you buy property, your tax bill is going to be crazy high compared to people who've been here for 20, 30 years. So long story short, it's a bit of a gamble, Prop 15, and I think we said that in our endorsement, but we are of the mind that the gamble is worth it, that we think that in the long term, the sort of restructuring of our property tax and our tax system in general is good for the health of the state.
A question for any of you, or maybe all of you. Which endorsement of all the ones on the ballot this year caused the most robust discussion within our team?
Prop 22.
Yeah, Prop 22.
Can you describe a little bit of the nature of the discussion?
Robust.
Well, there was no blood spilled. You can say that. That's thanks to
It
Zoom.
was a very split board on that one. We wrangled with that quite a bit.
And that's because, look, you can't ignore what's going to happen to a lot of drivers. If Prop 22 does not pass, there is going to be an impact on tens of thousands of Californians who rely on that income. And so that's what made this sort of a fraught discussion for us.
Yeah, and I think it's people's lives on the line in a very direct way. But it's also a larger issue. We are having these debates in the United States about income inequality, worker protections, the working conditions that lift people out of poverty. And Prop 22, to some degree, sort of encapsulates that. We've got somewhat of an imperfect system right now in California with AB 5, but do you really want to have mega corporations writing their own employment law? So it's sort of a real tricky dilemma of a ballot initiative.
It also
Well,
gets into a very cosmic discussion that we've had on several occasions about, what is the future of employment? What is the future of work? What kind of economy are we going to live in? Is it a new world in which people will have many different jobs at the same time? Will they work at home, which we've been doing during the pandemic? So it touches on a lot of really big issues.
And Carrie, I was going to say, I know you said don't believe political ads, but I see those TV commercials with the Uber and Lyft drivers saying that their lives are going to be over, that this will destroy them if that passes. And I do sometimes think,
Yeah, and it's a service that in general in California, we've come to use and love. And the idea that that could go away is a little troubling. But what's the trade-off?
What's the hardest endorsement you've ever had to write? And are there any that you later came to regret?
Wow. We could probably talk about the proposition that approved high-speed rail, which we were a little split on back when it came out, and we have re-endorsed our position several times, but the ramifications are very troubling still. So that was pretty tough.
Other takers, don't be shy.
Well, are we just talking about this election? Because I can tell you the hardest endorsement I've ever had to write was the in the gubernatorial primary between Antonio Villaraigosa and Gavin Newsom. Well, there were other candidates, but those were sort of the two top tier candidates. And it was a very difficult decision. And I've probably done more reporting for that one editorial than I've done for any collection of 50. It was weeks and weeks of calling people, just trying to get what was the core difference between these two Democratic leaders, former mayors, and what made them different, and which one would be better. So that was difficult.
And I'm continually doing guilty pleas to the rest of the board over an endorsement I did a few years ago, and the person is still in office. It was a tough split for superintendent of public instruction. I do a lot of work on education, and I chose Tony Thurmond. I felt that he would be a great example for many kids of color in this state, to see someone in charge of education who was a Black man who had come up through urban schools the way many of them do. He had some very good things to say. He'd done a lot of work with kids in the past, but I have been repeatedly disappointed in his performance, which I've editorialized on several times, so I'm not telling stories out of school. And so, still hoping to see more leadership, especially at this time of pandemic for the schools. They've needed a lot more leadership from Sacramento, and it hasn't been forthcoming. And I'm constantly sending little notes to the board about how I'm sorry again about that one.
I don't have a
confession. We have to make a choice between positions or candidates that we're not crazy about in any circumstance. I think of the Carmen Trutanich endorsement a few years back. And you can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, particularly when you're talking about candidates, because there's never going to be a perfect one. And sometimes you just have to make a choice, just the way voters have to make a choice, and hope that you've done enough reporting that your choice holds up.
And you're always go ahead, Carla.
I actually about, was it 4 years ago? Because David Rue's up for re-election now. I wrote the endorsement in the CD4 race last time around, and John worked with me on it. I really felt it was a huge field because it was the year that Tom LaBonge retired. So everybody was running. There must have been like 12 or 13 or 14 people running. And I really liked this one woman in particular who was running, Sheila Irani. I thought she'd be terrific. And it wasn't that we couldn't convince the rest of the board. At the time, we had a publisher who had somebody else in mind that he thought was a much better candidate. And we actually re-interviewed Sheila. We re-interviewed the candidate that the publisher liked. We talked about it again, and then we waited, and finally, the publisher, this was his prerogative when you are the publisher of a paper to be involved in an editorial page, and he finally said we could go ahead and endorse her. So we wrote this editorial. I wrote this editorial, and we endorsed her. She came in like 8th, which I always felt bad about, but I don't regret endorsing her at all. I liked her. I thought she would have done a good job. David Rue has done a good job in the office that he now holds. But that was just agony for a while.
I think a lot of the time for editorial writers, as we're talking to so many of these candidates, and we're doing this to give a chance to great candidates who don't have a lot of money behind them and thus aren't beholden to anybody. And to know before we do it that they haven't got a chance, and we go ahead and we endorse them anyway. But I do a lot on school board and schools in general, and that tends to be divided between those that are backed by unions and those that are backed by the reform movement, and there's big money both ways. And then you come across brilliant candidates who are just thinking for themselves and have wonderful ideas and amazing background, and you endorse them and they never make it. Well, one did once, and she was a terrific board member.
When you make an endorsement, do you expect that it will actually sway voters? And do you feel disappointed if it doesn't?
Yes. And yes.
Go ahead, Carla.
Yes and yes. I'm still very bummed that nobody voted for Sheila Irani. Yeah, absolutely. I think that people read these, and I think that they want to hear what we have to say about it. They think we've done a lot of research on this. They take it seriously.
I mean, sometimes there's not a lot of other information out there. Right. And so what we offer is critical. I think of races like judicial races and the LA Community College District races. There really is a paucity of good information out there. And so we're performing a public service, and I think that is influential. But otherwise, sometimes on a race that doesn't go our way, we're unhappy about it, not because it's an affront to us in any way, but because we think that the policy position that we were advocating was the right one, and the state would have been better off going the other way.
Having written the presidential endorsement, I have to admit that there are a lot of studies that indicate that endorsements for offices like president and governor tend to have less influence in people making up their minds than endorsement editorials for other offices on the ballot that we've just been talking about. But I think we still do a service writing about those races like a presidential race in educating people and getting the discussion going, in perhaps making people who are already inclined to vote for somebody to see another reason to do so, or to give second thoughts to somebody who is going to vote for the candidate we didn't endorse. So I don't think the total payoff is that we necessarily have to say that in a given race, we turned the result. And we do lots of different kinds of things in endorsements.
And I would add that during the rest of the year, we editorialize on a variety of policy matters that reflect a certain approach to things, reflect a certain set of values. And when it comes time to endorse a candidate for president, even if we're not going to sway any particular voter, we are sort of testing ourselves as to those views that we've expressed before, And we're testing to see whether we can find them reflected in the candidate that we support. And we hope that other folks look at what we write and test us as well. So even if they say, well, I don't agree with that argument in favor of that particular candidate, because I don't agree with the policy positions this editorial board makes on a lot of other things. That's okay. We do like to persuade, but that's okay. But we are going through a process of argumentation to make sure that we are being consistent and true to a particular line of argument and policy and value.
I guess I have a question for the board. How many of us voted or plan to vote exactly in accordance with what we endorsed this fall? Anybody?
Well, I'm 1 for 1 because I can't vote in California, and I did just do my mail ballot for president.
That's interesting.
No, I can hold two separate beliefs in my head: what's right for the editorial board and the way I'm going to vote, and they're not always the same.
That's a fantastic question. Another reader asks, when you disagree, do you ever have to take a vote? What's that like?
Oh, we just did that with, it was Proposition 18, which we haven't discussed tonight, but it's the one that would give 17-year-olds the ability to vote in the primary if they were going to turn 18 by the time of the general. And that was a pretty lively debate, and we split. It was a pretty close to even split, but we came out in favor of it. So there had to be a majority vote in there somewhere. I wasn't part of it.
We do vote, but it's not a pure democracy because there are some votes that count more. So, you know, that that matters, particularly when it comes to having a split vote. And on split roll, we had a very, very close vote. There were a lot of strong feelings on both sides because it's a very difficult issue and it's undoubtedly going to have a large impact. Some of us thought it would have more positive impact than negative, and almost equal amount of us believe the opposite. So,
how has social media changed the process of editorial writing?
Well, it's given us some insight into candidates we might not have otherwise had. We have famously, or at least among the board, rescinded, I think it was the first time ever we've rescinded an editorial endorsement for a candidate whose unsavory social media habits came to light in the general election after we endorsed him both in the primary and in the general. So that was interesting. For social media, this would never have happened.
And it is something else. It is another way for us to gather information about campaigns and about candidates.
I was just going to say that the very famous user of social media is somebody we did not endorse for president this year, partly because of some of his tweets and what they reflected about his approach to the office.
Sure. This gets to a related question. When you hear from readers, whether they're supporting or opposing the positions you've written, how does that influence this editorial board's deliberations?
I am the proofreader of all the letters that come in, and I read a lot of the comments. I do that for a couple of reasons. One, I want to see what the other arguments are out there, and I want to see how effective our arguments are, and see if we've missed something. And I tell you, I learned a lot from the letters. I learned a lot from the comments. They're not. I mean, it's a self-selected sample, so you can't say that this is what all readers think or whatever. And the same with the feedback we get on Twitter, which we get plenty of. But we're in the persuasion business, as several of us have mentioned. So when we fail to persuade, we need to know that. And if we missed something, we need to know that too, because our positions, we don't flip like a coin, but they can evolve as we get better information over time. and as the situation changes.
Yeah, and the volume of reaction, obviously, it goes way up when you have emails and tweets and comment boards. When I started, you would get the occasional phone call or letter to the editor pointing out perhaps that you got something wrong. We now get instantaneous almost reactions. And as John says, sometimes they point out things that we missed or we got wrong or other information that we didn't know about. So I think our reactions, we'd like to see it.
What's the most controversial editorial you've ever written or drafted?
Carla, why don't you talk about the one you wrote about David Delayden?
Yeah, I write about abortion rights, and we are very strongly for reproductive rights. We strongly support a woman's right to abortion. And David Delayden was the guy who he secretly taped or instructed people to secretly tape people in, was it at Planned Parenthood? I think it was Planned Parenthood. I'm like totally blanking on it now. And
that was Planned Parenthood.
It was Planned Parenthood. He was secretly taping meetings with people in Planned Parenthood, and there was a huge to-do about it. It got a lot of, it all came out, and it got a lot of, well, because they released their tapes to try and make Planned Parenthood look bad. And there was a lot of attention paid to it in the press. And he was the Attorney General for the state of California brought charges against him for, like, essentially, it's against the law to secretly tape someone in California. So he was charged with whatever the crime was. And we wrote an editorial saying that he shouldn't have been charged. Even though we didn't like what he did and we didn't like the way he tried to smear Planned Parenthood, we decided this was unnecessary and it was just throwing the book at him for political reasons. And I think the way the conversation went was we talked about this in a meeting, and then John said, "You don't have to do it if you don't want to, it's okay." And then I went back to my desk and I was talking, I believe, to Mariel and Carrie, and said, "You know what, I think I don't want to do it." Even though we talked about it, John said, "I don't have to do it." And Carrie said, "Oh, you have to do it. You should do it. It'll be really interesting and everybody will be shocked that we wrote it." And I thought about it some more and decided I was okay just from my own point of view about the whole situation. I was okay writing it. I don't believe he should have been charged. So we wrote it and we got like thousands of page views or whatever. And we got lots of response. And I, for a minute there, won a lot of approval from groups who generally spend their whole time saying bad things about me because of what I write about reproductive rights. So it was kind of a bizarre experience for me.
So interesting. I'm hearing the story for the first time.
I'm glad I wrote it.
Carrie, a question for you. There is a considerable discussion of city council race for District 4, where the incumbent, David Ryu, faces a spirited challenge from Nitya Raman. Our editorial board endorsed Ryu. There's been considerable debate about who's the more progressive candidate. How did we arrive at our decision and why?
Well, we interviewed both Nitya and David last November, I think, for the primary. We were impressed by Nitya. I mean, she's really smart, but we do have this criteria that we sort of established the way we evaluate candidates, and experience, track record, performance. Those are really important to us as an editorial board. And in the lead up to the primary, the writer who was the lead on that race, he made a lot of calls to people in the community, businesses, neighborhood councils, people who were supporting both Nithya and David, and there was another candidate in the race who was really good too. And just overwhelmingly was heard, that David Ryu is performing, that we like the way when we bring him concerns, he listens, even if he disagrees with us, he gives us a fair shot, he lets us make our case. So, when we're an editorial board, we evaluate candidates on both their sort of big picture city vision, and that's important. But we also look at how they serve their constituents. And when you have a council member, frankly, when you call a lot of people and you hear good things about a council member, an incumbent, that's kind of rare. So while we like Nithya, particularly on her homelessness work she's done in sort of the advocacy world, I think when we looked at the totality of David's record and the work he's done on the council and what we heard from the community, we just felt that he deserved and had earned a second term on the city council.
Thanks so much,
I think it should also be clear, if I could just interject, that we don't pick somebody based on how progressive they are, right? It's the quality of their ideas, the quality of their work.
John, the next question is actually for you. One of the propositions we haven't discussed is number 23, which would change the requirements for kidney dialysis clinics. We recommend no on Prop 23. Can you tell us why?
Sure. Prop 23's most important requirement is that it would have all these dialysis clinics have to have a doctor on duty whenever a patient is undergoing dialysis, which on the surface sounds like, hey, that's a great idea. But the problem here, there are a bunch of problems. It starts with the fact that they don't say it has to be a doctor who knows the first thing about dialysis patients. It could be any doctor. It could be a dermatologist. Doesn't matter. And the second thing is there already are physicians who, for a certain portion of the time, are with these patients. So there are federal standards, and California clinics comply with them. The other big point here, though, is the main thing this would do would be to raise the cost of dialysis treatment. And you have to remember, although the vast majority of people who get dialysis are dialysis patients, are Medicare, covered by Medicare, they have copays. And unlike other forms of treatment, there are no Medigap policies that cover dialysis. So it's hundreds or thousands of dollars every year for these people. They would be deeply affected by anything that pushes the price of their treatment up, which is why one of the major dialysis patient advocacy groups opposed it. And beyond that, the proponents of it are the SEIU UHW. They're doing this mainly because they're trying to organize the two big dialysis chains that are in California. And for them, it's a tactic. It's not really about the health of dialysis patients in our judgment.
And finally, a question for Mike. Have you taken a stand on whether the Electoral College should be abolished or whether the United States should move to ranked choice voting?
We have not taken a position on ranked choice voting, as far as I know. We have definitely and repeatedly said we need to get rid of the Electoral College. We also have supported California getting involved in a somewhat complicated arrangement. It's a compact in which the states that participate agree to give their electoral votes to the winner of the national popular vote. But this scheme kicks into effect only when enough states to equal 270 electoral votes sign up for it, and that hasn't happened yet. But I think this election and some of the doomsday scenarios that people are spinning about what might happen if there's a disputed election really, I think, solidifies our resolve to write more about getting rid of this very creaky vestige of the early part of the Constitution. And lots of people don't realize when they vote that they are actually voting for electors who, at the beginning of the history of this country, were chosen by state legislators. And there's even one sort of doomsday scenario about this election, that some Republican legislators in states that Trump will lose might say, oh, well, there was fraud, so we're going to appoint our own electors. Seems to be pretty unlikely, but it's a reminder that we're laboring and voting under an unrepresentative, undemocratic system that we've sort of, we've tried to fix it and make it more democratic, but it's fundamentally not the way you should be electing the president.
One final question. What do you expect to happen on November 3rd? And what if there is not a clear result on that day?
What I think is going to happen is that President Trump, if he's doing well in the ballots that are counted first, is going to argue that he won. That's at least a possibility. And if mail ballots come in later that change that, he sort of indicated that he might say that it's a rigged election. So a lot of experts and election officials who have looked at this have suggested that we in the news media be very careful this year and not rush to declare winners on election night, because this is a very unusual election. More people are voting by mail, and it's going to take longer, and we don't need the instant gratification of being able to say, oh, there's a winner, when we're not really sure. And we need to get out of this habit of thinking that that's the way it's going to happen on election night.
It's also worth remembering that that's only one race on a ballot that's going to be full of them in states and counties across the country. So I think one of the things that is going to actually help here is that there'll be lots of issues that people care about. And in many states, in many circumstances, they're going to know, look, the results aren't in. We don't know what's happening yet with Prop 15, Prop 22, Prop 18, whatever they care about. And so their expectations are going to be dampened. Their expectations for results are going to be dampened by that. And so I think that may help calm the waters.
We've reached the end of our 90 minutes. We are now going to look at the results of the final poll question. Did tonight's discussion of the ballot propositions change your thinking about how you plan to vote? Click all that apply. While the one that had the most persuasive effect, it seems, is Prop 14 on stem cell research, followed by Prop 15 on property taxes, our DA endorsement, and Prop 22 on gig workers. Very, very interesting. Thank you all for joining us and for sharing in your comments and questions. You can find all of the issues and endorsements that we've discussed tonight at latimes.com/endorsements. If you have any further questions, reach out to us on Twitter at LATimesOpinion or send us an email at letters@latimes.com. Thank you, everyone, and good night.
Good night.
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 Thank you.